Hey everyone, welcome to Mountain Beast Mysteries. Bigfoot reports nowadays are nothing like they were in the past. They sure are traumatizing and scary to the people who, experience these things, like the actual encounters, but they're nothing like what they once were. A lot of the tales from the frontier are violent, they involve people getting killed, and they seem like these creatures back then were a lot more dangerous than they are now. I don't know why that is. Maybe because back in the day is when we were really invading, the territory. A lot of the land was still uncharted to us, and maybe nowadays they're just more used to people being around, and we're not really invading any more territory than we already have. We've already taken over everywhere in the wilderness. We've been everywhere. But back then, they must have been like, what the heck are these people doing, coming into our areas, coming into our land, and just destroying the place? I don't know. Maybe it's back in the day they wanted to sell more newspapers, because a lot of these stories were circulating around in the newspapers, and that's how word got out that there were these wild men roaming around the forests. So that could be another reason. But there's a story that is very, very famous, written by Teddy Roosevelt back in the day, in the late 1800s, in his book The Wilderness Hunter. A lot of you probably already heard of it. I've talked about it before on the channel in years past, because it's one of my favorite stories. But it is one of those stories where it involves somebody actually getting killed in a quite terrifying, brutal way. And the character of Bauman, I don't know why I called him a character, the person. He could have been a character. It could be a made up story. But Bauman supposedly actually told Roosevelt about this story in person. And at that point he was already like an old grizzled mountain man. But the story took place back in his younger years in Idaho, the Bitterroot Mountains along the Salmon River. And basically the story is this. Bauman and a buddy of his ride off on horseback to do some trapping. They're going to go trap some beaver. So they head off on horseback into the wilderness, into a valley or whatever, to set up these traps. They're going to be gone for a while, for multiple days. And they finally get to a point where they can't take the horses any further, so they ditch the horses in a meadow, and they carry off on foot for the rest of the way. And they finally come to an area that they deem fit for beaver trapping. So they set up a camp, they build a lean-to shelter out of debris, out of logs and whatnot. They leave their packs behind, and they head off for the evening to set up their beaver traps. So as they're gone, things seem quite normal. It's a beautiful area, and nothing is really happening until they get back to their camp, and they notice the camp is destroyed, the lean-to has been destroyed, their stuff is strewn about all over the camp area. And they're wondering, what the heck could this have been? They notice there's these weird footprints around that look like they could be made by something on 2 feet and almost human-like. So they're wondering, why would somebody do this? It could have been a bear, but the tracks don't really look like a bear. So it's is there a person around here doing this? It's pretty weird. So they end up, building a new shelter. They get their camp set up again. And later in the night, Bowman, not Roosevelt, Bowman is awakened by something in front of the lean-to, and it looks like the silhouette of something that resembles a Sasquatch. It's this weird creature, and he also said that there was a really, really weird smell in the air that was not a good smell, which is interesting, because if that's the case, if that is true, it's one of the earliest reports of this smell that people do report when they run into Sasquatch. That's something that's very common in Sasquatch reports. So that's an interesting detail. Anyways, Bowman takes his rifle and he fires at this thing in the darkness. He suspects he misses it because the thing takes off, crashing through the brush, and disappears. And so that really startled them. They didn't really get much sleep for the rest of the night. And in the morning, they can see the tracks in the day, and they do look very strange to them. They don't know what's going on. They're obviously freaked out because something was visiting the camp. But anyways, they decide to head out again to check their traps and probably to set up more traps. So they head off, and eventually when they come back to camp again, later in the day, the camp is once again destroyed, and everything's all over the place. And they're freaked out, obviously. So they rebuild camp as best as they can, and they notice in the evening, like later in the night, this thing is like across, like a little ways away, there's a creek that's between them and this creature, but this creature comes back and it's like sitting on a hill watching them, and it's making weird noises, like weird moaning sounds, and they're like freaked the heck out. But they're witnessing this thing for like an hour or so, just like watching them, and that is creepy. This thing has come back, and despite coming back and just like observing them, it didn't really come very close to the camp that night. It stayed quite a ways away, but they were able to make it through the night, and in the morning they decided, based on like the strange events that were occurring, that they should probably pack up, recover their traps, and get the heck out of there, because it's just pretty weird, right? I wouldn't want to be lingering around there trapping either if things were going that way. So that was their decision. Their decision was to pack up and get out of there, but there were traps still out that they had to check and recover. So the plan was Bowman would hike off, recover these few traps that were out, and the other guy, his friend, would get their packs ready and make sure the camp was all together, and they could just, when Bowman or Bauman, or however you want to say it, comes back, they could just throw their packs on and leave, head back to the horses and get out of there. So Bauman hikes off and leaves his friend behind. He finds the traps, which all have beavers in them, and he ends up like skinning them and whatnot out there. So it takes him a little bit of time, like a few hours or so, to do that. And by the time he gets back to his camp, he's approaching the camp and he's yelling for his friend. He's hollering at him to let him know he's coming, but he doesn't hear a response back. And when he gets closer, he realizes his friend is like laying there dead, and he's got big like bite marks in his neck, like 4 fang marks in his neck basically. And what it looked like is that he was sitting there, he had got the packs ready, and he was just sitting there waiting for Bauman to get back, and something came up behind him and pulled his head back and bit his neck and basically ripped his throat out essentially, and killed him. And so, like, wasting no time, Bauman just takes nothing but his rifle. He leaves his pack and all his other belongings behind, and he just runs off towards the horses and gets out of there. So whatever this thing was, it showed up again, and while the one guy was alone just sitting there waiting, it snuck up behind him and killed him. And that's the story. And Bauman makes it out alive, and it's the story after that. That's all it is. So is it true or not? I don't know. Not once was the name Bigfoot mentioned, Sasquatch, but they mentioned the name like monster and goblin. It's not like they knew about the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot, because that wasn't popular back then. The word Sasquatch is not even the original like term for the creature by like indigenous people, and obviously Bigfoot isn't either, and that term wasn't made popular until like the 50s. So it's interesting that there were stories like this, wild man stories, back in the day before the subject was popular. There were terms like mountain devil thrown around, wild men, things of that nature, but not Bigfoot. But it does, like, when you think about the behavior of the creature, it sounds like a Sasquatch. It's leaving footprints that are human-like, walking on 2 feet. It's got the odor that people report nowadays. But what is different from reports of nowadays, like of today, is like the violent nature of the attack. We don't hear stories like that ever. And I don't know if it's because they don't happen. There's a lot of stories of people going missing under strange circumstances, bodies showing up. Is that hidden? Like, do things like that still happen and are hidden from us, hidden from the people, because it would frighten us and terrify us and scare us from going out into the woods? I don't know. I would guess that doesn't really happen. It just doesn't seem like it. It seems like these violent reports are something from the past. Is it because we were invading their territory back then? Like, they weren't used to us and we were just like entering their territory, like destroying things? I don't know. And nowadays, we've already conquered all the land. It's all charted nowadays, so it's hard to say. And it could just be a story. Like, it could just be a story, like many of them. There's a lot of tales from the past that do seem like, you know, classic campfire kind of stories. At the beginning of the story, of this story, it's also mentioned that like other people have gone missing or something, or there was a body that was like ripped apart and discovered, like the remnants of it were discovered by some prospectors in the area. So Roosevelt sets the story up like that. He gives it like a creepy vibe from the beginning, you know, a story of a body that was ripped apart, and then they go off on this adventure into the woods and encounter this thing. It's kind of like how you would set up a made-up story, but I don't know. I just think it's interesting that we don't get reports like that anymore, and it makes you wonder which of these stories are true and which are made up. But that's all I wanted to talk about today. Just share that story, especially for those who haven't heard it before. It's one of the coolest and, you know, most thrilling Bigfoot stories because there's an actual like casualty. But I'm glad that we don't hear about a lot of, you know, encounters like that today, especially when you're out in the wilderness alone like I am right now, because that would be terrifying to have an experience like that. But thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Mountain Beast Mysteries.